This is Professor Lewis's home. Shukran. You don't mind doing this drama.
In that case, you should let me brush my hair.
It's okay.
Please go there.
Nice to meet you, sir.
Can I get you something?
I'm fine. It's okay. A little bit of water is fine.
Just water?
Fresh water is fine.
I don't
Diet soda.
Huh?
Diet soda is fine.
Diet soda, which one?
Anything. Diet Coke. Thank you.
I have Diet Pepsi. Just sit down.
Okay. He said that. So you were saying that, and he was expecting the book. That's interesting.
Well, I wanted to send it to him, but I've been warned not to send things by mail. So,
Yeah, that's maybe that's the case. Yeah.
so how can I get it to him?
You can give it to me, sir. Well, but I have it. I can give it, or if you want to sign one.
Well, I want to grab it. I'll be back in a moment.
Okay, sir. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for this opportunity. I really appreciate
It's
it.
tough.
Okay. As you know, my interest is in Orientalism as a subject, and it started to be famous and notable with Professor Saeed's
Well, even before that.
attack on it. Yeah, from Abdul Malik and
Abdul Malik and, well, he was the most important one, yes. But it didn't start with Edward Said. He certainly made it celebrated, yes.
We made it famous.
Yeah.
And it did make some changes in Middle Eastern studies, didn't it?
Yes, many changes.
To the positive, to the negative? Is it objective or it's no more objective?
Mostly, I think, negative.
Negative.
I think that it's had a considerable effect on the teaching of Middle Eastern studies in American universities, and I think it has been mainly negative. One very important thing, for example, I think you will agree that if you want to do anything serious in Middle Eastern studies, whether it be history or literature or even politics, you have to know the language.
Yes.
I mean, what would you think of an Arab or Chinese or Japanese specialist on the United States who lectures and teaches on American history and literature and doesn't know English?
Good
And, what?
Good point.
It would be absurd.
Yes.
And it's equally absurd the other way around. Now, unfortunately, because of the Saeed's line, learning Arabic is now suspect.
You're intruding in other people's
Exactly.
world just by learning Arabic.
Exactly, you're being a cultural imperialist.
Isn't it fascinating that you find a professor in Saudi Arabia who are extreme Wahhabi
Yes.
doctrine, but they will have the same view of Edward Said? Isn't that a little bit awkward? That he will go in the same line with Wahhabis?
I would rather put it the other way around, that he is following the Wahhabis in this. No, you see, I mean, what he has done, unfortunately, is to provide an ideological justification for ignorance and incompetence.
That's very true.
And, you know, there's always a market for that at the universities.
And it just spread around, and now they're following this bias in hiring professors.
Exactly.
That's going on.
I mean, if you study Arabic, you're suspect.
But is it applies to other societies as well? Like I know that applies to Japanese people. If you study Japanese and you don't look Japanese, that's something they don't like very much. They feel that part of their privacy.
Yes, but I mean, they do respect Japanese scholarship in the West, just as the Chinese respect Chinese scholarship. I'm not aware of any equivalent of this in any other part of the world. I mean, for example, in Turkey, people who take the trouble to learn Turkish and study Turkish history and Turkish literature are welcomed.
Yeah.
The same is true in Iran, in India, in China. And I mean, this rejection of the outside scholar who learns your language, this, as far as I know, is just Arab.
So it's in the genes, or is it?
No, it's Said.
It's Said.
There was very little of it before that.
Mm.
I mean, if you look, for example, had the first Arab acquaintance with Orientalist scholarship. It's very positive. I mean, there were meetings of Orientalists in Europe already in the 19th century. And we have records from Middle Eastern, Arab and other scholars who traveled to these meetings and were very impressed by what they heard, by the people they met, and wrote about it.
But that's in the scholarship field. But like, say, the Egyptians' attitude towards the French invasion to Egypt.
Well, that's something else. I mean,
so there was a people side and there's a scholarship side.
That's nothing to do with scholarship.
Yeah, there's nothing to do with it. But there is attitude of rejecting the other, of not accepting the other very easily.
Yeah, but you see, it works both ways. When Europe invaded the Arab world, this was simply the last phase, the latest phase, in a story that had been going on for more than 1,000 years.
Yes.
I mean, for 1,000 years the Muslims were invading Europe. The Arabs in Spain and Sicily, the Tatars in Russia, the Turks in the Balkans. And then after 1,000 years of suffering this, the Europeans finally turned around and said, enough, we're going to invade you. And they did.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting to compare the different reactions. And you see, the Europeans went to the Arab countries and they were interested. They studied the language, they studied the culture. The Arabs spent 800 years in Spain and they never showed the slightest interest in Spanish or Latin or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
The Turks for 500 years in southeastern Europe. They showed no interest whatsoever in the Greek and the languages, the history, the culture, and so on. Now, the Muslim attitude was the normal one. It was a European attitude that was odd, because not being interested in other cultures is the normal human pattern.
Yes.
And it's the same with the Chinese. The Chinese created a great civilization. They never showed the slightest interest in any other civilization, or the Indians.
But would we say the curiosity started with Christianity by itself being an Eastern religion from somewhere else?
I think that is part of it, but it's not the whole of it. But there is this curious fact that Christian Europe alone developed this kind of intellectual curiosity about other civilizations. The Chinese didn't have it, the Indians didn't have it, the Muslims didn't have it. And in the case of the Muslims, it's very near because, as I said, they were invading and occupying parts of Europe for more than 1,000 years. And they never showed the slightest interest or curiosity, which is normal. It was the Europeans that were being abnormal.
The European curiosity.
Yeah, and I think the reason is what you say, but I wouldn't say the reason is Christianity, because I don't think there's anything in Christianity which requires this. The reason was that because of Christianity, their holy places were in the Islamic world. In order to visit their holy places, Muslims go to Mecca and Medina. These are Arab cities under Arab rule. If a Christian wanted to go to Nazareth or Jerusalem or Bethlehem, he had to travel not just to another country, but to another civilization. Another point. For Muslims, their holy scripture is the Quran. The Quran is in Arabic, in their own language. For Christians, their holy scripture is the Bible. The Bible is partly in Greek, partly in Hebrew, partly in Aramaic. So they have to, the very foundations of their religion are in Oriental languages and in a Middle Eastern country. So this kind of curiosity, I think, is understandable in relation to this. The Muslims have no comparable incentive. And then, of course, you must add the fact that for 1,000 years the Europeans were under threat from Islam.
Yes. So you have to study the other in order to know who is the other.
Exactly. I mean, they were confronted by a dangerous and advancing enemy who was richer, stronger, more powerful, more advanced in every way.
If we talk about the Renaissance, the phenomena of humanism, you mentioned that very often, the starting point of humanism, it's a great contrast with fatality or
No, but the Muslims also had their renaissance earlier. I mean, if you go back to Abbasid Baghdad, they also had a renaissance which came in much the same way as the European Renaissance. I mean, the European Renaissance comes with the rediscovery of the classics. And this is what happened in Abbasid Baghdad. They had translations into Arabic of earlier works from Old Persian, from Greek, and this gave them a kind of renaissance.
How long was this peak?
I wouldn't say that the Renaissance there is a renaissance, but it's earlier.
Yeah. How long is this peak of the Muslim civilization? How long is the peak of the Muslim civilization? Because it's exaggerated sometimes, and people go back and forth about how long is it, and how glorious was it?
Well, I think there's more than one peak. I mean, you can't just sort of measure rise and fall like that. I think Muslim civilization reached its height, I suppose, with about the time of the accession of the Abbasids, in the early Abbasid period. But it continues to be important, creative, flourishing for many, many centuries, until it starts going wrong in the 17th and 18th centuries. So you can't talk about a peak lasting for 1,000 years, but you can talk about a period of greatness.
Said blames the West for most of the Arab ills, but are they better off now that when they are independent now, or they prove themselves now they're independent? Or
look, Said blames the West for the Arab ills. As you say, there are several problems with this. First of all, Western rule in the Arab East, other than Egypt, that's to say Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, it started after the First World War, it ended after the Second World War. So that the whole period of Western rule in the Eastern Arab world was a little more than a quarter of a century. It's now more than half a century since it ended. And it doesn't get better, it gets worse.
It gets much worse.
You see, Aden was a British colony, okay. Hong Kong was a British colony, and Singapore was a British colony. Look at Hong Kong and Singapore, and look at the Arab East. I mean, it's very easy and tempting to blame the imperialists, and certainly the imperialists did a lot of damage, but not nearly as much damage as the local rulers did.
How can you compare that to Israel? Now it's 50 years, a little bit more, and it's got independence and it's multicultural. And now we hear that the Prime Minister is going to sell some spy equipment that India, of 1 billion people, don't have. How brilliant that is.
Israel is a very difficult case for the historian because it's one specimen and only 50 years, a little more than 50 years. And you know, historians make big comparisons. They like to have larger numbers.
They go more grand history.
And obviously one can look at Israel and see very interesting phenomena. But to generalize about Israel, I think is different. But I would make one point, which I think is important. And I have made this point before, and I have been criticized very severely, inside and outside Israel. My point is this: Judaism is a religion, but Judaism is not a civilization. Christianity and Islam are not just religions, they are civilizations. These are two major civilizations in human history, which have very, very much in common. I think one could say that the clash between Christendom and Islam was due more to their resemblances than to their differences. Now, Judaism, as I say, it's a religion, it's a culture, it's a way of life, all those things, but it's not a civilization. Now, the Jews were part of a larger civilization, and mostly of these two. So, if you look at Jewish history in the last 2,000 years since the destruction of the ancient Jewish states, there are Jewish communities in India and China, but they're totally unimportant. They are unimportant in the history of India and China. They're unimportant in Jewish history. I mean, what matters in Jewish history takes place either in the Muslim lands or in the Christian lands. So you have two different kinds of Jews. And nowadays, as you know, people talk a lot about the Judeo-Christian tradition. One could equally well talk about a Judeo-Islamic tradition.
Absolutely.
Because there were very important, creative, significant Jewish minorities in Muslim countries.
Is there similarities in the practice of religion in so many aspects?
Oh yes, many.
Yeah.
You see, just as the Jews of Christendom were affected by Christian ways, by the civilization of which they were a part, so the Jews of the Islamic world were affected by Islamic ways, and by the civilization of which they were a part. And a very large part of the religious and legal literature of the Jews is in Arabic, because that was their language, that was the language they used. I mean, Hebrew was a religious language, and it was a legal language, and a theological language, even a poetic language, but it wasn't a language of everyday use.
Arabic was the language of knowledge, especially...
Yeah, the language of science at the time was Arabic.
Yeah.
And so you had these two Jewish communities with some communication between them, but not a great deal. And I called them the Christian Jews and the Muslim Jews, using the words Christian and Muslim, not in a religious, but in a cultural and civilizational sense.
Mm-hmm.
And there were always differences. I mean, for example, a rabbi is a rabbi. But a rabbi in England or France is more like a Christian clergyman.
Mm-hmm.
And a rabbi in Iraq or Iran is more like a mullah.
It's totally different.
Not totally different,
a little bit
very different.
Different perception.
Very different. I mean, it even affects things as intimate as marriage. In the Christian world, Jews do not permit polygamy. In the Muslim world, they did. I mean, you know, that's something quite important, I would say. Among the Jews of the Islamic world, right up to our own time, polygamy is permitted. Not concubinage. They did not permit concubinage, but they did permit polygamy. And you still find it among Yemeni Jews, for example, and so forth. So, what becomes very remarkable in Israel is, for the first time, in one small country, you have two different civilizations. Civilizations which have been in conflict for 1,500 years or more, which are suddenly brought together in one country, one religion, one government, two civilizations. And this is what makes Israel a very, very interesting place.
Well, let's add to that, people coming from all over the world with just affiliation with the religion.
Yes,
and
yeah, they're coming from all over the world, but basically from two civilizations.
Is that the secret of great civilization? Is that the one?
Diversity.
Diversity.
Oh yes, I think diversity is certainly valuable. اختلاف أمتي رحمة.
That's very true. Yes, I agree.
Now, you mentioned before, this is how we got started on this point, you mentioned the successes of Israel in science and technology. These successes come from the Western part. I mean, these are the Christian Jews, not the Muslim Jews, if I may put it that way.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And but now, for the first time, they are beginning to intermingle. There were a lot of conflicts between the two. I mean, for example, you have a Polish Jew and a Moroccan Jew. Well, they are both Jews and they share the same religion. But there is a very profound sense in which the Polish Jew is Polish and the Moroccan Jew is Moroccan.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this inevitably leads to cultural clashes and even to political clashes.
But for me, as an Egyptian, to walk in Israel,
yes.
I will be invited by a fellow Egyptian who left the country 40, 50 years ago,
yes.
and I will be invited over to his home, just like that. I won't be invited by another Jew. So the Egyptian Jew is affiliated with
yes,
me.
Of course.
Yes, with the language, with the music, with their, they have Egyptian movies,
oh, yes.
Egyptian channels. Yeah.
The literary and musical entirely. Yeah. But it goes further than that. I say, even things as intimate as marriage
mm-hmm.
and how are we doing?
Really fun.
marriage and the rabbinate,
Ah,
and so on.
okay, one second, please. Okay, doing great. Of course, it can be edited later.
Yes. So what's happening now, of course, is that they are really coming together. What you have is an increasing amount of intermarriage between the two. In the early stages of Israel, they only married their own kind. Polish Jews married Polish Jews, and Iraqi Jews married Iraqi Jews, and so on. Not anymore.
Not anymore.
I mean, it still happens, of course, to some extent.
But language united them, the new culture united them,
Exactly.
hostility from
Exactly.
abroad united them.
And what most unites them is the pressure from outside.
Yes, of course.
I mean, being under siege, surrounded on every side by enemies who want to destroy you. This is a very powerful unifying factor. I would say that the survival of Israel is thanks very largely to the Arab League. I'm serious. I mean, if you consider when it started in 1948, I mean, 500,000 people from, I don't know, 40, 50 different countries with all kinds of disagreements and differences between them. And I think the chances of that country surviving would not have been very good.
Yeah, personally.
One would have expected it to fall apart. And I think it would have fallen apart. But it was the Arabs. The Arabs were not able to achieve Arab unity, but they were able to achieve Israeli unity.
Something else about Orientalists. They're attacked by religious groups for being, many of them, missionaries, including Reverend Watt, Gibb, etc. Is that not Gibb? But is that something against them to be a missionary? Because you already declared your belief. How did you express it with others?
Well, certainly some of the Orientalists are missionaries. In the earlier stages, many more. In modern times, much less. But yes, I mean, as a statement of fact, it's true that Orientalism in its earlier stages was very theological. But I don't know that that's an objection to it.
So you're telling us, just focus on the matter, focus on the subject,
Yes,
on the
exactly,
outcomes.
yes. Focus on the method and the subject and rather than look for ulterior motives.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as the missionary is concerned, the motives are not ulterior, they're very clear.
So just that. Okay.
Yeah. You see, Said argues that these Oriental studies were the servant of imperialism for practical purposes. Just consider, when they started Oriental studies in the European universities in the 15th and 16th centuries, what did they establish? They established chairs of Arabic. Now, in the 15th and 16th centuries, Arabic was no longer important. There were only two powerful independent Muslim empires, the Turkish and the Persian, and their languages were Turkish and Persian. Even in North Africa, they used Turkish. Morocco was still the only place where they used Arabic. But in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Libya, the language of government and commerce was Turkish.
Including Egypt.
And in Egypt too, of course.
Yes.
Now, if their purposes had been political and commercial and military,
Yeah, it was scholarship.
they would have studied Persian and Turkish.
That's right.
But they didn't. There were no chairs of Persian and Turkish. They set up chairs. There were no chairs of Persian and Turkish for the same reason. There were no chairs of English or French or German. Because in those days the university was not concerned with such things. They had chairs of Latin and Greek and Hebrew. And since Arabic was the classical and scriptural language of Islamic civilization, it was appropriate that Arabic should take its place together with Latin and Greek and Hebrew.
The translation movement from Arabic to English, when did it start? Or was always happening? Was there a peak time when people...
Well, it's been going on ever since.
Ever since.
Ever since the 17th century. We found the first important translations in the 17th century. And from then onwards, it's been continuous. You know, a good example of the false accusations, you know the story that when the Arabs came to Egypt, by order of the Caliph Omar, they destroyed the Library of Alexandria.
Yes.
You know the story.
Yeah, you know the story. And I know you defended Omar. I was surprised about that because there's a good reason to think that Omar did cause the burning of the library.
The story is false. Now, the story is that Omar asked them, what is in these books? Does it contain what is in the Quran or does it not? If it contains what is in the Quran, we don't need it. And if it contains what is not in the Quran, then it's evil, so destroy them. This is the story,
Yes.
which is told in various Arabic chronicles.
Yeah.
Now, the story is untrue, and we know that it's untrue for several reasons. The first one is, it does not appear in any source of the time, not Arabic, not Coptic, not Greek, not Christian, not Jewish. You can hardly believe that something as important as the destruction of a great library would have passed unmentioned in the, after all, these were civilized peoples, and they had written languages and they had historians, not a single mention of it until hundreds of years later.
And that's how we know that...
So that's enough to show that it's
Yeah.
false. Now then the question is, where does it appear? Well, it first appears about the time of the destruction of the Fatimid library by the Ayyubids.
Yes.
You know, when the Ayyubids
The
took power in
Sunnis.
Egypt,
Yeah.
they gave orders to destroy the Fatimid library, which they said contained heretical Alawi and Ismaili
That's
scholars.
true.
Now, the Egyptians were civilized people, and whether they were Alawi or Ismaili or Fatimid or anything, they did not like seeing a great library destroyed. So they produced this story to justify it. If Omar did it,
Really.
it's okay. I mean, this happens, you know, that if you want to show something is good, you can show that it was done by the Prophet or by the companions of the Prophet.
Just make association between the event and the story.
Just to justify it.
Justify it.
Now, so we know that it's false, we know when it was invented, we know why it was invented. Now comes the interesting thing. The Saidians will say, well, this is a malicious slander invented by the Orientalists to discredit Islam, right? It's exactly the other way around. It was invented by Muslims, not to discredit Islam, but to give credit to destroying a library. And the lie was discovered by the Orientalists.
Here we go.
As far back as the 17th century, an English Orientalist scholar, Pocock, who was the first professor of Arabic at Oxford University, he was suspicious about this story. And he examined it closely and he showed that the story was a lie.
Thanks to the Orientalists in this matter.
Yeah.
So the Orientalists not always like picking on the negative side of Islam. It's actually the opposite sometimes, or
Very
most
often,
of the time.
most of the time, it's the opposite, yes.
Said repeatedly said he's not an expert in Islam. Any comments on that?
I agree with him.
But how would you be not an expert in a matter and keep on talking about it and attacking other people about it? Why didn't he just keep on talk about literature?
He does what he wants to do.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, in order to criticize somebody's work, you would think you should criticize them for what they say.
Yeah.
I mean, many of the opinions he criticizes as mine, I agree with his criticisms, because they're not my opinions. I never held or expressed these opinions. He invents something, attributes it to me, and then criticizes it.
He invents intentions. He talk about intentions,
That's right.
not what's written.
He invents intentions and opinions, which I don't hold and have not held. I mean, if somebody wants to criticize my work, this is perfectly normal.
Yeah.
If someone wants to find that my results are bad, good. I'm willing to be convinced. I mean, this has happened on occasion. But to produce a sort of a whole invented philosophy of intentions and so on. By the way, you know writings of Fuad Zakaria?
Of course.
Naqd al-Istishqaq.
No, I know about others, yeah.
Fuad Zakaria wrote a long study called Naqd al-Istishqaq, which is very good if you're interested in this subject. There are two good critiques of Saidian approach in Arabic. One is by an Egyptian, Fuad Zakaria, and it's called Naqd al-Istishqaq. And the other one is by a Syrian,
Al-Azm.
Tariq al-Azm.
Yeah.
You know him, yes.
Yes. I'm trying to meet him right now when I go to... I'm trying to meet him through crossing from Turkey to Syria when I go there.
Give him my regards.
Oh, I will.
Please do. صدق لازم الاستشراق والاستشراق
المضاد معاكس
معكوس
معكوس
الاستشراق والاستشراق معكوس. Yeah.
Something else. You did have a prediction about how Islamists living among us can turn out to be something negative, or you didn't have a positive perspective about Islam the way it's going right now. How can we relate that to what happened in 9/11 and what's coming?
I wouldn't put it in terms of positive or negative. I was trying to correct a common Western misapprehension. You see, in the modern West, religion is not very important. And even for the individual, his religious identity is usually of rather secondary significance. They therefore tend to underestimate the significance of religion for other people. A simple example. You have an organization of the Islamic Conference. You have a bloc of Islamic states of the UN. You have regular meetings of Islamic foreign ministers and Islamic education ministers and so on. You don't have anything like that for Christian ministers. There's no organization of Christian states or Buddhist states.
Well, they've been through the experience
I've already passed that.
Yeah,
exactly. But for that reason, people fail to understand the significance of religion in Muslim identity and in Muslim politics. I published an article in 75, I think it was, 75 or 76. I published an article which I called The Return of Islam, in which I said that Islam is still important in a way that Christianity is no longer important in the identity and political life of these countries. I pointed to the growing tensions in the Islamic lands and to the fact that Islam can talk to people in a way that is immediately intelligible. And I said in this article that I think Islam will still be a major factor and could even take power if the right leadership emerges. Well, 3-4 years later it happened in Iran. Now when that article appeared, Saeed went into an absolute rage.
Yes, in his chapter of Orientalism Now, he speaks.
He denounced it. This article turned out to be a correct prediction of the Iranian.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Then in 90, I published an article in the Atlantic Monthly. I didn't like the title of it. It wasn't my title. It was the editors who gave it the title. The Roots of Muslim Rage. And they put that awful picture on the cover.
Oh, yeah.
I must say, I agree entirely with all the critics of the picture. I think it was in bad taste and misleading and so on, but I was no way responsible for that. I didn't like the title, The Roots of Muslim Rage. I gave it a different title, The West, A View from the East. But, you know, that's less exciting than The Roots of Muslim Rage. But anyway, in that article I tried to point to the growing anger in the Arab world and the danger of it exploding.
Yeah.
And again, Saeed and his henchmen were furious. And again, unfortunately, I was right. I would rather have been wrong.
Sir, it's right here, next to his, what he said right here. I'm saying, after 9/11, isn't that right? Right here. Before I met you right now, I just wrote it down. You were right about your prediction. He said that, he's saying that you see Islam as a shop, like Orientalist painting that doesn't develop. And he goes on and on and on, that Orientalists are just having a glimpse of Islam at one specific period of time that doesn't develop
This
around.
is simply not true. We see it develop. He doesn't see it develop in the direction he wants. I mean, he produces a kind of idealized Islam.
He is very idealistic, that's for sure true. Yeah. One cannot question his good motives, that's for true. But he's not not objective in his
He's totally unobjective. He's also, how should I put it, incredibly ignorant. I mean, he says, for example, in one place, he's talking about the Muslim advance into Anatolia and into North Africa, and he says, well, Islam came to Anatolia long before it came to North Africa. Well, it came to North Africa in the 7th century. It came to Anatolia in the 11th century.
Yeah. You pointed that out, I think, somewhere.
Yeah.
Talking about anti-Semitic literature, now it is daily in Egyptian TV or Arab TV. You see some,
Yes.
and it's going to extreme beyond any time before. Egypt was in war with Israel till 1980, and we never saw anti-Semitic literature.
No.
Now we're seeing it.
Yeah, why?
I wonder, is it a new perception or new hatred that's coming on and developing?
Well, it's a new officially sponsored campaign. I think there's no other way to describe it. Not only in Egypt. You see the same in other Arab countries. Not all. In Jordan, for example, it's there, but it's relatively low-key. But you see it very much in the Palestine Authority.
Oh yes, they have channels.
Yeah. You don't see it much in Morocco.
Yes, that's true.
Well,
you don't see it. That's true. Yeah.
No,
not as much. No.
the Arab world is not all the same. And I don't need to tell you that.
Yeah.
Mr. Said doesn't know it, but there are differences.
You had high regards to Professor Gibb and others.
He was my teacher.
Oh, that's why.
Yes, he was very good. Yes. You know,
he's born in Alexandria, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's born in Alexandria.
Yes.
Mm.
You know, before he was knighted, he was Mr. Gibb. And in English universities, people don't usually use titles. So he was known as Mr. Gibb.
Mm-hmm.
And his students, we used to call him Amir al-Mu'mineen al-Mustaqib Billah. Mr. Gibb Billah.
And the reason for that is why would you think? He was a little bit sympathetic with Islamic culture.
Oh yes, well we all are.
You are.
I mean, you don't spend your life studying a culture
without respecting it. Yeah.
Without respecting it and without having a sympathy for it.
Mm. But being in it, being a Muslim, you don't accept the criticism at all, especially being a believer. And that's the way it is in the Muslim world, isn't it?
Yeah. And if you look at the Orientalists, apart from the missionaries, there is no criticism of the beliefs. This is not our business.
Azhar refuses to read any Islamic, any Orientalist production.
Yeah, I mean, belief is not our business. What I'm concerned with as a historian, if I may quote myself, is not what Islam has done to the Muslims, but what the Muslims have done to Islam.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Who others of the Orientalists that you have high regards to and you think one should study carefully and the books? You focus on a historian, it seems you never focus on theologians or...
Well, theology is a subject which I tend to bypass.
I noticed, yeah.
Yes. I don't really know much about it. And I'm interested in it only insofar as it has historical consequences.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you have a religious text which has La Ikrah al-Din, that's important.
Yeah, that's related. Yeah, to historical context.
Exactly, that has a historical context. Or the one I quoted you before, which is a hadith, or maybe a hadith. Ikhtilaf ummati rahmah. That's a very interesting statement.
Yeah. Because it's against the collective thought that we have now.
Exactly.
We believe in the oneness in everything. Yeah.
I mean, it took the Christians 1,000 years to get to that point.
That's true. Khedive Ismail. Ismail, the Khedivit, I think I don't know what they call it in English. Khedivit, Ismail. Ismail, he was the king of Egypt.
Khalif, yes.
Khalif.
Ismail. Yes.
Ismail. He said, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe. It is therefore natural for us to abandon our former ways." He said that in the 1860s. Mm-hmm. And later on, there was said back and back again. And then we see Ataturk. What's your comment about this spirit, starting from Ismail to Mustafa Kemal, that you admire very much?
Yes, Mustafa Kemal, yes. They did a lot of good. They also did some some serious harm, without bad intentions, but the consequences were very bad. You see, the bad consequences which are blamed on the Orientalists or on the imperialists, for the most part, were the work of people from the countries. Because imperial rulers are usually very cautious and very conservative.
Mhm.
And they try to change as little as possible just to keep things
Yeah,
going.
they are, yeah.
The ones who bring in the great reforms are people from the country, like the Khalid Ismail or Ataturk or the Shah and so on. And what they did was what they called modernization and what some people call westernization. That's to say they were trying to impose Western methods, Western standards, Western patterns of organization and behavior on the Islamic world. Now, in some respects, it did a lot of good. I mean, for example, they abolished slavery. I think you would agree that abolishing slavery is a positive step.
Absolutely. Ismail did that, started
Right.
that. Ismail did start
Yeah,
that.
they-
With Gordon and,
Yeah.
yeah.
They improved the status of women, which again I think is greatly.
Absolutely.
But they did some bad things too, and two in particular. One of them is the reinforcement of the state power, simply by the modern technology. I mean, because of modern technology, modern weaponry, modern communications, modern transport, it meant that even a small local ruler today has greater power over his people than Suleiman Kanuni or Harun al-Rashid or any of the others. They were weak compared with the modern rulers because of this modern apparatus of government. The second thing which they did, which is again I think a disaster, unintended, was the weakening or removal of the intermediate powers. Is it the characteristic of the traditional Muslim state is limitation and consultation. It wasn't a democracy. They knew nothing of democracy. There was no system of election or representation or majority decision.
There was even no concept of nation.
Exactly.
A nation.
What they did have was the concept of consultation.
Sure.
Exactly. وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. And this is not just words, this is a reality. Even a mighty Muslim ruler like the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmet Fatih or Suleiman Kanuni, to do something, he had to call together the important people. He would meet with the chiefs of the military, with the chiefs of the religious people, with the, what you might call the bourgeoisie of the cities, the gentry of the countryside. In order to get anything done, he needed the cooperation of these people. Because we didn't have modern means of enforcement. So, in a very real sense, traditional Islamic government was limited and consultative. It was authoritarian, certainly. You can even say it was autocratic. It was not despotic or dictatorial. There's a very important difference.
I have 3 more questions. I'll try to make it short.
No.
Actually, I don't have much time. What's the story behind Encyclopedia of Islam? How it started, who started it, how you communicate with all these scholars to develop a project like that?
Well, I had nothing to do with the first edition. That was before my time. The first edition was started a long time ago. It began under the initiative of the Royal Academy of the Netherlands. And they got in touch with other academies in England, France, Germany and other countries. And they formed an international committee to publish this thing progressively, going through the alphabet. They completed the 4 volumes, they did a supplement, and then they decided, now it's a new world, we need a new one. So with the same international committee, I mean, constituted from the same groups, not the same people, of course, the same kind of international committee, British Academy, Dutch Academy and so on, they formed an international advisory board, which in turn appointed an editorial board, And there are two boards. There's one of Western scholars and one of Muslim scholars. And then there's the editorial board who do the actual day-to-day work, which just consisted of 3 people. And this is an international enterprise with contributions from many, many scholars all over the world, including many Muslim scholars.
Yes.
And it's now completed. The 2nd edition is completed, and they're now talking about doing the 3rd edition.
Based in still on
Same principle,
yeah.
but with a new committee.
The committee. I followed that. I believe I communicated a little bit with Dr. Rippin, Professor Rippin, scholar of Islam.
Yes.
We talked about Fuad Zakaria, and he talked about Al-Azm. What do you think of Judge Ishmael as a writer, as somebody who was in the list, the 10 list that were found when the fundamentalists assassinated Sadat? And till now he's under threat, he lives with day-to-day guards.
I know. I think he's a man of high intelligence and integrity and courage, especially courage.
What about his writings? His writings? What is his contribution?
If people are willing to listen, to read and listen, it would be a great contribution. Unfortunately, they are not willing.
Mm-hmm.
You see, what happens is he tries to provide a way of modernization within Islam. They reject this. And they are forcing people to choose, not between old-fashioned and modern Islam, but between Islam itself and modernity. So I think in a sense that he is trying to save Islam, but they won't let him. They are forcing a bad choice.
I appreciate your time. This was
You
very
agree
nice.
with me?
Yeah, of course I agree with you. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate that, the hospitality here.
I'm delighted to meet you.
Thank you.
Let me give you, I hope I have a copy of it here. I'm not sure I have. Excuse me one moment. Yes, I do have one.
That's great. Oh. It's rare collection. It's very nice. And the view is very nice.
Yes. These are books about Orientalism.
And see Orientalist paintings right here.
Yes, I have a collection of these early prints and woodcuts.
An unbelievable rare picture of Ataturk.
Yeah, that's a very early print of Ataturk.